Welcome to the Generation Open podcast with LDR21, a podcast about workplace culture and leadership that leads to transparency and an open organization. Today, we'll be talking with Sam Knuth, the Director of Customer Content Services at Red Hat. He is an open organization ambassador and a writer for the opensource.com community. Here's your host, the founder and CEO of LDR21, Jen Kelchner.
And Sam, we're really happy to have you with us on one of our initial episodes we have for the podcast. I have to go straight in before I let you talk. I love one of your quotes that you have on your LinkedIn, which is talking about the fact that you believe that there are better outcomes happen when we break down internal barriers and work together for mutual benefit, and focusing on finding pathways to enable and mediate true collaboration. I thought it was pretty amazing. So I just wanted to lead off with that as we kind of introduce you. So thank you again for joining us on our topic today.
Great, thank you.
So today we want to talk about assuming positive intent and its impact on collaboration, community, and inclusivity, and some of these core things that we see happening in the workplace today. So you recently published an article on opensource.com about what happens when we just assume positive intent. So can you kind of give us some context around that article and before we kind of dig into this?
Sure, yeah. In an open organization like Red Hat's, what we have is a lot of feedback that's going on all the time. Whether you're looking for feedback or not, you're probably going to get it. And sometimes in that feedback, I feel like we lose an element of assuming that everyone has the same fundamental interests at heart. And so, you know, when something happens and somebody's asking a question about it or trying to provide some feedback, sometimes they might start from a standpoint of assuming that this person was trying to do something destructive or nefarious somehow. And so this theme has been coming up for me and for several other people at Red Hat, kind of thinking, you know, we love the culture that we have here. We love the open dialogue. We love the feedback. But if we could all start from a place of assuming that we all have the same fundamental goals, and that we all want the same kind of success for the company, then it might just be easier for everybody and save a lot of distress. And so this is something actually that a group of us was talking about, and then I had this experience that made me really just reflect on, wow, yeah, I think that we have this problem on the team where people are actually not trusting the intentions of each other, which can really create a difficult environment.
Right. Where does some of that stem from, do you think? Just in your discussions with other colleagues?
Well, I think it comes from, first of all, a lot of people work together in our global organization who don't necessarily know each other. Mm-hmm. They maybe have not met in person. They come from different countries, have different cultural backgrounds, have different perspectives on things. But also, everything is just moving really fast. And I think this is something that most people can relate to, is there's just a huge volume of communication. There's a huge volume of information. There's a lot of action items. There's a lot of deadlines. And so when you're under that kind of stress, I think it's makes people more susceptible to reacting with their emotions rather than being more thoughtful about it. So if something happens, you immediately might think, why is this person trying to sabotage me? Or, gosh, why is this person doing this stupid thing? Rather than, there must be a misunderstanding between me and this person, because I'm sure we both want the same thing, but for some reason I feel like, this isn't going in a constructive direction. It takes a real effort, I think, to stop yourself, to pause, and to really think about, what's going on here? How can I respond to this in a constructive way?
Definitely. I think that's, think about like reactions and responses that people have. It's one of the things I like focusing on is kind of the psychology behind our behaviors, why we do what we do. And, you know, sometimes that's developed from past events. Sometimes it's just misunderstanding. Like you said, you're walking into a situation, having the wrong assumptions instead of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt that they're on the same page with you, at least until you can discover and dig in a little deeper. You know, we tend to just have these trigger responses instead of taking the time to pull back and see what's really there under the hood.
Exactly. And I find that becoming aware that you have those trigger responses and then trying to catch yourself when you have them and redirect that response, it's actually really hard, and it takes a lot of deliberate effort. And so, you know, it's something that I think that it doesn't happen naturally. So we need to really practice and raise the awareness of it in order for people to kind of think through things from that other perspective.
This makes me think, it's slightly off topic, but it makes me think of some of the work and studying I've been doing on the generational differences that we have in the workplace. And there's this, you know, really a cognitive dissonance that's occurred, especially when people of my age or older, we look at millennials, and there tends to be this knee-jerk reaction of, you know, the blanket statement, the entire group and generation, that they don't look at them with positive intent. They look at them with, you know, they don't want to work, and all the other labels that they like to associate with the group. But because of that, they've had maybe one negative interaction with someone of a different generation that they don't like. So everybody they meet that falls in that group, they automatically then assume, you know, you must be exactly like the other person, which I think causes a lot of this dysfunction we see in our workplace.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is not just, I noticed that in several areas. For me, I probably noticed that kind of issue the most when it comes to people who are in different countries. So, you know, we have an office in Australia, we have an office in the Czech Republic, we have an office in India, and then we have a bunch of people in the US. And, you know, many, many times I've heard people from one region say something like, oh, you know, the people in Australia do blah, 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 or the people in the Czech Republic, you know, always react this way, or something like that. And really, it's just anytime you hear that kind of generalization, that's sort of raises my red flag and makes me think, are we really thinking about what's happening here? Or are we just trying to find an easy answer? And I see that a lot, and it's really easy for people to slip into that, I think. And again, I think it takes deliberate effort to resist that temptation.
So how did some of this resolve in your article, the example that you've given where there was just some really just perspectives were not all there, and like you said, people were not at a place of taking the time to assume positive intent? And how did that work out for somebody from a leadership standpoint? How did you deal with the dynamic that was going on in the team?
Yeah, so this case was especially problematic, and I definitely simplified the situation a bit in the article just for the sake of fitting everything in there. In this case, we did a combination of talking things through with people and trying to help the group see things from each other's perspective. It also took a lot of discussions between the leaders of the different departments. So we have, my team does the product documentation, then we have the engineering team, we have the QE team. Each of those teams has its own perspective and its own deadlines and its own sources of stress. And they all tend to blame each other when things are going wrong and when it's not clear how to resolve. And this case actually took quite a lot of discussion and also agreement on goals and regular updating each other on milestones. So just more communication, more transparency between the groups. And that helped to establish a certain level of trust. And then we also did bring in some new people. So we moved some people around, put some people on a different project and brought other people in to try and bring some fresh faces. And, I really don't like to do that because moving people for me is kind of a last resort where it's like the heaviest possible tool that we could use. And it's very disruptive. Mm-hmm. But in some cases, it does really help just to have somebody who has a more of a neutral perspective, somebody who doesn't have the history or any previous conceptions of things. And those perspectives can be more neutral and more willing to see things from the other side.
Right. So that kind of leads right into that piece about collaboration and why assuming positive intent is very important to collaborative teams and efforts. Because here in this example, you've had to do some things you didn't want to do. So maybe some more extreme things of, like you said, moving people around into other projects and the disruption that occurs. So let's talk a little bit about collaboration and why having this mindset is very crucial to effective collaboration.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was just on another discussion this morning trying to resolve another conflict that came up that kind of got escalated to me over the past couple of days. And this one really hits it that where, both groups involved here really are having basically feel like they're having their workflow interrupted by the other group. So one person will do something, and this is involving like code repositories. So, one person makes a change in the code and submits it, and that causes a problem with somebody else's code. So it's very much a collaboration piece. And in order for people to work effectively together, people who are not in the same place, who are working at all kinds of different hours of the day and could easily overlap with each other, there really has to be some clear communication and guidelines. And for some reason, this group keeps having these misunderstandings where they think they've agreed on the process, but then somebody does something that stomps on somebody else's work, and it causes a lot of frustration and conflict. And the kinds of things that I was hearing from, I basically kind of wanted to talk to people in both teams and sort of get a sense of what was going on. And they both said the exact same thing, that the other group was, didn't care about anyone except for their own work, and didn't care about us and our perspective, and just wanted to stomp all over everything and dominate. And it was interesting because they both felt the exact same way about the other group. They literally almost used the exact same words to describe the other group. And so it just seemed to me right away, this is just a classic communication issue where they're both assuming the other one's doing something evil. And they're both assuming the other person's deliberately trying to piss them off or just deliberately not caring. When in reality, they both had the same goal. They're both very well-intentioned. They're all very reasonable people when you talk to them separately. But when you kind of get into some of these details, they get really fired up. And I think it's because of the emotional reaction they have at the time. Again, it's a stressful situation. They all have more work than they can do by the deadline. And so I think that really creates a more difficult environment.
I was going to say, that's kind of where that communication piece comes in then, which I think a lot of our struggles boil right back down to communication or lack of, or not clear communication. Yeah. And so I think, positive intent is one thing in our mindsets, but being able to effectively and clearly and consistently communicate is kind of that key to all of it.
Yeah. And this is where, I don't know if you talked to Brian about the open decision framework, but this is where the open decision framework has a really powerful tool called the common fact base. which I think is really important in these situations where you can document some of these things, because what I'm learning is that you have people who don't share the same first language, and they also, if you have two people who are in different job functions, like an engineer and a technical writer might see things in different ways. They might both use the same words, but those words mean different things to each of them. And so that, even when they are communicating, or when they think they're communicating, they really might not be communicating as well as they think they are, because they actually have different meanings behind what they are saying. And so using something like a common fact base to have definitions, lay out expectations, lay out processes, I think can really go a long way towards resolving and preventing some of those communication challenges.
Definitely. So Red Hat's obviously a very large organization, and as you said, kind of dispersed from a global standpoint, having multiple offices. Is this something that with talking with other colleagues at enterprise size businesses, that you see this sort of thing occurring elsewhere? I mean, I feel like I've seen it at all levels, but it seems as though sometimes the larger enterprise-sized organizations are less open, pardon the pun, open to changing that and looking at how they deal with these core issues at the individual level. Like positive intent, going back to that word, is really, as a mindset, is something that, like you said, it's intentional. Someone has to actively work at changing the way they think about it, intentionally going into conversations a certain way. And it's an active thing from day to day. And often and I know Red Hat's very different from being an open organization, but it seems as though in the larger companies, they're less apt to want to deal with core issues like this at the people level, right? It's just hurry up and do your work. You've got a project, deal with it. Do you find that as well when you've talked with other companies, that it is a challenge?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge everywhere, and I think it's a human thing, and it gets more complicated as a company gets bigger. And I think companies that are growing go through a lot of challenges. Red Hat's an open organization, but we are just as resistant to change as anyone else. Because I think that's really a human thing, regardless of the structure or philosophy of the company. What I find about the open culture is that there's more of a tolerance for people who are unhappy with something to go ahead and say that. And so maybe in another company that doesn't have that kind of culture, people might have these frustrations and keep them bottled up and just deal with them privately, or just kind of be unhappy. And Red Hat is the kind of place where if somebody's unhappy, in most cases, they're going to say they're unhappy and talk about why they're unhappy and really try and fix that. And so maybe that means that these issues come out more. I'm not sure, but I do think that it's a universal problem. And honestly, I think it could happen. I think it can happen in small companies too. Anytime that people have a dependency on each other, and there's a lot of work and maybe some stress and some deadlines, and not as much time as we'd like for communication.
Right.
And especially if people have any kind of distance between them physically, if they're in different locations, different time zones, those things exacerbate the problem significantly.
Definitely. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this episode up. What else could you share with us? Any words of wisdom on collaboration or intent, or anything we should be looking at coming up, thinking about in terms of our teams?
Well, I think the thing that has been most helpful for me on this topic is just the thing that has helped me improve the most on this is just remembering to pause. And anytime when somebody brings you a problem or starts describing a problem and talking about how somebody else is doing this awful thing, I find it's just so easy to get sucked in and be like, oh yeah, tell me more about that. Like, what else did they do? Then what did you do? And you can really get sucked in. But for me, if I just stop and think about it and then start asking questions more about how well do we really understand the motivations that are happening here, rather than saying things that might egg on the unpleasant direction of the conversation or egg on the complaining, that it can get you to a much better place much faster.
Definitely. Great tips. Well, we really appreciate you being on this episode, and we will talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Special thanks to Sam Knuth from Red Hat for joining us on episode 3 of the Generation Open podcast. Thanks for listening to the Generation Open podcast with Leader21. If you would like to find out more about how to improve the health of your organization, or would like information on our Rapid Change program, go to our website, LDR21.com. That's LDR21.com.